There was a man who spent 10 years fixing the exact problem he was fired for discovering. Every defective engine that rolled into his shop carried his fingerprints, not because he built them broken, but because he built them first. Vanguard Motors took his design, buried his warnings, destroyed his career, and then quietly paid him to clean up the mess they refused to admit existed. For a decade, Ethan Caldwell said nothing. He just kept every record, every part number, every invoice. And when the whole thing finally collapsed, when people started dying, they came back to the one man they thought they'd erased. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The sign above the bay door had been repainted twice in 12 years, but it still read the same. Caldwell Auto. Honest work. Fair price. The letters were slightly uneven on the second A, because Ethan had done it himself on a Tuesday afternoon when he probably should have been doing something else, and he'd never bothered to fix it. That small imperfection bothered some people. Ethan didn't mind it at all. Donar, Ohio was the kind of town that didn't appear on most maps unless you were already looking for it. Population just under 4,000. One grocery store, 2 diners, a hardware store that closed early on Fridays, and the kind of main street that looked like it had been quietly losing the argument against time for about 30 years. People stayed because they had roots there, or because leaving felt harder than it used to. Ethan stayed because he chose to, which was a different thing entirely. He'd bought the shop 11 years ago with money he'd saved and a small loan from a credit union in Columbus that he'd paid off in 7 years instead of 10. The building was a converted 2-bay garage with a small office in the back and a storage room that most people assumed was full of old parts and obsolete equipment. It was full of those things. It was also full of something else. On the morning that mattered, the morning everything started moving again, Ethan was underneath a 2019 Chevy Silverado listening to the owner describe a noise he couldn't quite name. It's like a knock, but not all the time. The man, whose name was Carl Bissett, crouched down and spoke toward Ethan's boots. More like a thud, when I accelerate from a stop. How long's it been doing it? Ethan's voice came from somewhere beneath the chassis. Maybe 3 weeks. You mention it to anyone else? Took it to the dealer in Kettering. They said they couldn't find anything wrong with it. Ethan slid out from under the truck on a creeper, sat up, and looked at Carl without any particular expression on his face. He was 44 years old, medium height, the kind of lean that came from actual physical work rather than effort at a gym. His hands were the thing people noticed first. They were a working man's hands, knuckled and stained in the permanent way that no amount of scrubbing quite fixed. When's the last time you had the transmission fluid changed? Carl blinked. Is that a thing people do? It is, Ethan said. Get me the keys. I want to drive it around the block. He drove it. He heard the thud. He knew what it was before he got back to the shop, but he drove it twice more just to be sure before he said anything, because that was how he operated. He didn't guess out loud. He confirmed first. Torque converter, he told Carl when he came back. Fluid's been neglected long enough that there's probably some damage to the internal clutch. I can look at it, but there's a chance you're looking at a replacement. Carl winced. How much? Let me open it up first. I'll call you before I touch anything that costs real money. That was the other thing about Ethan Caldwell. He didn't commit to a number until he had a reason to, and he never did work he hadn't been authorized to do. It was a small distinction that a lot of shops ignored. He didn't. He was back under the truck when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He let it buzz. It buzzed again. Then again, which was unusual enough that he rolled out and looked at it. The number wasn't one he recognized, but the area code was Columbus. He answered it with grease on his fingers and the specific mild irritation of a man who'd been interrupted mid-diagnosis. Caldwell. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that he almost hung up. Mr. Caldwell. The voice was a woman's. Controlled, professional, but with something underneath it. A tension that people put in their voice when they were trying not to sound as worried as they actually were. My name is Victoria Vanguard. I'm the CEO of Vanguard Motors. I'd like to meet with you. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. How'd you get this number? He said. We have a contractor relationship on file. Your shop has received units from our logistics division for the last— I know what the arrangement is, he said. I've been part of it for 10 years. I'm asking how you personally got my personal cell number. Another pause. Shorter this time. Our legal team compiled a full contact list for everyone involved in our service network. Mr. Caldwell, I want to be straightforward with you. Then be straightforward, he said. What do you want? I want to talk about the recall. He set the phone against his leg for a second. Outside, a car pulled off Mercer Road into his lot and sat there running, someone deciding whether they were in the right place. Ethan watched it through the open bay door. After a moment, it pulled back out and drove away. He put the phone back to his ear. I don't think a phone conversation is a good idea, he said. If you want to talk, come here. To Dunar? To Dunar. He paused. Bring a lawyer if you want. I don't care. But I'm not going to Columbus, and I'm not going to a hotel conference room, and I'm not going to any place that has your company's name on the building. You want to talk? You come to my shop. He could tell from the silence that this was not what she'd expected. He waited while she processed it. All right, she said finally. When? I'm free Thursday afternoon, after 2. I'll be there. He hung up and went back under the truck. The recall had been public knowledge for 6 weeks by then. It was the kind of story that started on automotive industry blogs and trade publications and then worked its way up to the national news once the numbers got large enough to be genuinely alarming. Nearly 300,000 vehicles. The Vanguard 5X 7-engine platform fitted in 3 different model lines across 2 years of production. The failure mode was specific and ugly. Under certain load conditions, an internal oil pressure fault could cause the engine to drop power suddenly and without warning. On a highway, that meant vehicles that suddenly decelerated from 70 miles an hour to 40 in a matter of seconds. There had been 31 accidents attributed to the failure. 4 fatalities. 4 people. Ethan had read that number on a Tuesday morning in March, sitting in the small office behind his shop with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he'd sat with it for a long time before he went back to work. He had known about the pressure fault. He had known about it before the VX7 was in production, before it was in development, technically. He had known about it because he was the one who found it. Ethan Caldwell had gone to work for Vanguard Motors in 2001, fresh out of an engineering program at Ohio State that he'd paid for himself through a combination of academic scholarships, part-time work, and the kind of careful, grinding financial management that left no room for mistakes. He wasn't the flashiest graduate in his class. He wasn't the one the recruiters chased, but he had a specific quality that certain good engineers have, and most people in the industry don't fully appreciate until it's too late. He could hold an entire system in his head simultaneously. Not just the part in front of him, the whole thing. Every interaction, every dependency, every point of stress. He was assigned to the powertrain division, and within 3 years he was leading a team developing what would eventually become the VX series engine architecture. It was ambitious work. Vanguard was trying to thread a specific needle. They needed an engine that was lighter, more fuel efficient, and more powerful than what their competitors were producing. And they needed it on a timeline that the executive team had set without consulting the engineering division, because that was how things worked at companies like Vanguard Motors. Ethan built something that could have been exceptional. He was proud of it in the quiet, cautious way he was proud of anything. Not loudly, not in a way he broadcast, but genuinely. He thought the architecture was sound. He thought the engineering was right. And then he found the fault. It wasn't obvious. Nothing that subtle ever is. It was buried in the interaction between the oil pressure management system and the load sensing software. A scenario where a specific combination of engine load, oil temperature, and software response time could create a cascading failure in the pressure circuit. The window was narrow. The conditions had to align just right. But they could align, and when they did, the engine would drop out. He caught it in simulation. He ran the simulation 40 times to make sure he wasn't wrong. He wrote it up in a formal report, 18 pages, detailed, specific, with the exact parameters of the failure condition and 3 proposed design modifications that would eliminate the risk. He submitted it up the chain on a Thursday morning in late 2007. By the following Wednesday, he'd been called into a meeting. The meeting was not what he expected. He'd expected engineering review. He'd expected to walk through the technical findings with the division leads and talk through the proposed fixes and their timeline and cost implications. He'd sat through dozens of meetings like that. He knew how they went. This one had 3 people from legal and the division VP, a man named Gerald Stokes, who wore expensive shoes and had a way of looking at people like he was doing them a favor by being in the same room. "We've reviewed your report," Stokes said. "Okay," Ethan said. "What do you think?" "We think it's a worst-case scenario analysis that doesn't account for real-world operating conditions." Ethan looked at him. "It accounts for operating conditions that occur on American highways every day. Our testing didn't replicate the failure." "Your testing parameters were different from mine. I can walk you through." "Ethan," Stokes put both hands flat on the table, "we are 8 months from a production deadline. The VX7 represents 4 years of development and a significant capital investment. What you're describing would require a redesign that would push the launch by at least a year. What I'm describing is a safety issue." The legal team exchanged a look. Ethan noticed it and filed it away. "We appreciate you flagging your concerns," one of the lawyers said. Her name was Patricia, and she said it in the flat, practiced way that lawyers use when they're managing a conversation rather than participating in one. "The division will continue to review." "I want that in writing," Ethan said. Stokes looked at him. "Excuse me? I want documentation that I submitted this report, that it was reviewed, and that the division is taking it under consideration. I want that in writing before I leave this building today." Nobody said anything for a moment. "That's an unusual request," Patricia said. "I'll wait," Ethan said. He waited 40 minutes in a conference room while they figured out how to handle it. What they produced was a document that acknowledged receipt of his report and stated in carefully neutral language that the engineering division had reviewed the findings. It said nothing about the proposed fixes or any timeline for action. It was precisely crafted to be technically accurate and completely non-committal. He took it, thanked them, and drove home. 3 months later, his role was restructured. The VX series architecture team was folded into a different division. His new assignment was to a department working on a project that hadn't existed 3 months earlier, and he suspected had been created specifically to give him somewhere to sit. His access to VX7 development was revoked. His original engineering documentation, the design files, the simulation data, the architecture specs, was reclassified under a division access code he no longer held. They didn't fire him immediately. They just made the work smaller and smaller until it wasn't really work at all. And then 6 months after that, when he transferred to a different team twice looking for something real to do, they held a review meeting and told him they were eliminating his position as part of a departmental reorganization. He left the building with a cardboard box and 11 years of documentation that he'd copied to a personal hard drive every night for the last 3 months, because he had understood exactly where things were heading. He drove to Dunar, where his father had grown up and where he had a cousin he liked, and he bought a garage. The contract work with Vanguard had started 2 years after he opened the shop. It came through a logistics company called Tercel Distribution, a layered arrangement with enough distance between Ethan and Vanguard that most people wouldn't have connected them. But Ethan recognized the engine codes on the first batch of units that came through. VX series, early production, returned under warranty claims that had been routed outside the official service network. He could have refused. He thought about refusing. Instead, he took the work, did it well, invoiced Tercel Distribution at the agreed rate, and added every unit to a separate log he kept in a green ledger in the storage room. Make, model, VIN, engine code, failure mode, date received, repair performed, date returned. 10 years of that ledger. 3 of them, eventually. He told himself it was practical, it was good money, and the work was real, and he was good at it. He told himself that as long as he documented everything, he wasn't complicit in anything. He wasn't sure. Sitting in his office in March reading about 4 people who hadn't made it, whether he'd told himself the truth. Thursday came in slow and overcast, the sky the color of old concrete, the air still carrying the particular cold that Ohio keeps until April refuses to give it back. Ethan was in the middle of a brake job on a 2017 Honda CR-V when the black Cadillac SUV pulled into his lot at 2:15. Two men got out first, large, efficient, in the way that private security is when they've been doing it long enough to stop looking obvious about it. Then a woman. Victoria Vanguard was 51, with the kind of posture that comes from either good breeding or deliberate effort, and dark hair going gray at the temples in a way she apparently hadn't tried to stop. She was dressed like someone who'd tried to dress down and not quite gotten there. Dark slacks, a simple jacket, flat shoes. She looked at the garage the way city people look at things that are older and more worn than they expected. Ethan wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked out to meet her. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "You can call me Ethan." He didn't offer his hand because both of them were still grimy despite the rag. "You want to come inside? I've got a coffee maker that works." She glanced at her security detail. "I'll be fine," she said to them, and followed Ethan into the shop. He poured 2 cups of coffee in the back office, moved a parts catalog off the second chair so she could sit down, and handed her a mug that said Ohio State, Motor City Bowl 2011, and had a chip in the handle. She took it without comment. "You've been following the recall," she said. It wasn't a question. "Hard to miss," he said. "I've been CEO for 14 months. I came from the financial side. I was brought in to address some structural issues in the business." She held the mug in both hands without drinking from it. "When the recall came up, I started pulling files to understand what we were dealing with. I found a report." Ethan didn't say anything. An engineering report from 2007, author listed as E. Caldwell, Powertrain Division. She looked at him. 18 pages. It describes the exact failure mode that caused the recall. Exactly. The pressure fault, the load interaction, all of it. Written 16 years before those 4 people died. The word died landed in the room and sat there. "I've been advised by our legal team that I shouldn't be having this conversation without counsel present," Victoria said. "I came anyway, because I needed to ask you something in person." "Ask," Ethan said. "What did you do with everything else?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the storage room, and opened the door. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a while without speaking. 3 filing cabinets, 2 large plastic storage bins, a shelf of green ledgers lined up in order, 12 years of hard drives, labeled by year, in a fireproof box on the bottom shelf. "I documented everything," Ethan said. "Every unit that came through this shop, every engine code, every failure mode, every repair, every date, every communication with Tercel Distribution." He paused. "I have the original report. I have the receipt document from the 2007 meeting. I have records of my access being revoked and my position being eliminated." He paused again. "I have some other things too." Victoria turned to look at him. Her face had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The professional composure was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. "Why did you keep all of it?" she asked. He considered the question. It was a fair one. "Because I built that engine," he said, "and then I found out what was wrong with it, and I told the people who needed to know, and they took the engine and left the problem in it and gave my name away to someone else." He looked at the storage room. "I kept everything because I figured someday somebody was going to need to know what actually happened." He looked back at her. "I just didn't figure it'd take this long." Outside, the wind picked up and something metal rattled against the bay door. A chain Ethan kept meaning to rehang that swung loose in weather. He'd been meaning to fix it for about 3 years. Victoria set her coffee mug down on a workbench. "I want to see all of it," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "I figured you would." They started with the green ledgers. Ethan pulled the first one off the shelf and set it on the workbench between them, and Victoria opened it the way people open things they're not entirely sure they want to see. The pages were dense with his handwriting. Not messy, but compressed, the way an engineer writes when he's trying to get a lot of information into a small space without losing precision. Each entry had a date, a VIN, an engine code, a failure description, a repair notation, and a column on the far right that Ethan had labeled simply Source, which in every single case read the same 2 letters, TD Tercel Distribution. "How many units total?" Victoria asked, not looking up from the page. 412 over 10 years, Ethan said. Give or take a few in the first year when I wasn't keeping as careful a record as I should have been. He paused. I went back and reconstructed what I could from invoices. The ledger reflects my best accounting of everything. She turned a few more pages. Her expression hadn't changed much, but something in how she held herself had a slight forward lean, the professional distance replaced by something more chic. These are all VX series? Mostly. Early production VX7, some VX6 late builds. A handful of the VX8 units from the first year before they corrected the casting spec on the lower block. He reached past her and pointed to an entry from 2019. Those ones weren't the pressure fault, different issue, thermal stress fracturing, but related. Same fundamental architecture, same decision to push the design past where the testing had actually validated it. Victoria closed the ledger and looked at him. You knew about the VX8 issue too. I knew the architecture was carrying risks that hadn't been fully addressed. I didn't know the specifics on the VX8 until the unit started showing up. Did you report it? To who? He said it without heat, just flatly. I was gone by then. I was a mechanic in Dunar, Ohio. I had a contract with a logistics company that officially had nothing to do with Vanguard Motors. She picked up her coffee mug, remembered it had gone cold, and set it back down. You could have gone to NHTSA. Yes, Ethan said, but you didn't. No. She waited. He turned and leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed, and he took a breath. This was the part he'd thought about more than anything else in the last 6 weeks, and he still didn't have a clean answer. I told myself I was gathering evidence, that what I had wasn't enough yet, that I needed more documentation, more proof of the pattern, before I took it somewhere it would actually matter. He stopped. That was true. It was also convenient. Victoria didn't say anything. The money was good, Ethan said. Not exceptional, but steady. And the work was real, and I was good at it. And I think somewhere in the back of my head I knew that if I went to the regulators, all of this went away and I'd have to fight a company worth $12 billion with a box of papers and a hard drive. He looked at the storage room. That's the honest version. The 4 people, she said. Yeah. His voice was quiet. The 4 people. The chain outside hit the bay door again. Neither of them looked toward the sound. Victoria set both hands flat on the workbench, a gesture that reminded Ethan oddly of Gerald Stokes in that conference room in 2007, though everything else about her was different. I'm not here to assign blame to you, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan, I'm here because there are people in my company, people who were in my company long before I got there, who are about to argue that this recall is a product of random manufacturing variants and an unforeseen interaction in the software that nobody could have predicted. She looked at him steadily. I have one engineering report from 2007 that proves that's a lie. But one report from a man they fired 16 years ago isn't going to be enough. They'll say you had an axe to grind. They'll say the report was speculative. They'll attack the methodology. The methodology was sound, Ethan said. I know, but I need more than sound methodology. I need to show a pattern of deliberate concealment. She nodded toward the storage room. You said there were other things. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he walked back into the storage room and opened the bottom drawer of the third filing cabinet, the one that was slightly harder to open than the others because the runner had bent at some point and never been replaced. He pulled out a manila folder and brought it back to the workbench. Inside the folder were photocopies. 8 pages, slightly degraded from multiple generations of copying. Ethan had made the first copy in 2008 from an original document he had no business having, obtained through a channel he'd kept deliberately vague in his own records. The original had been an internal memo from Richard Vail, who at that time held the title of Senior Vice President of Product Development and Risk Management, a title that Ethan had always thought said everything you needed to know about how Vanguard thought about risk. Richard Vail, Victoria said, reading the name at the top of the first page. He's been retired 4 years, lives in Scottsdale. Ethan watched her read. He was the one who ran the 2007 meeting, not Stokes. Stokes was the face in the room. Vail was the one making the call. The memo was addressed to 3 names in the engineering division and 1 in logistics. The subject line read VX7, Warranty Return Protocol, External Service Network. The language was careful, corporate documents from that era usually were, but the substance was clear enough if you knew what you were reading. Vail was establishing the channel through which defective VX7 units would be routed to outside shops rather than processed through the official warranty system. The memo described it as a supplemental service validation program, but it laid out specific criteria for which failures qualified, and those criteria mapped precisely to the failure mode from Ethan's 2007 report. "He knew," Victoria said. She said it quietly, more to herself than to him. "He knew in 2007, Ethan said. "This memo is from 2009. 2 years after I flagged it, they'd already set up a system to manage the failures quietly. Not fix them. Manage them." "Where did you get this?" "Someone sent it to me. Anonymous, through a P.O. box I had at the time. No return address, no cover letter, just the memo in an envelope." He paused. "I have ideas about who it was, but nothing I could prove, and whoever it was clearly didn't want to be connected to it." Victoria looked at the pages for a long moment. "This is significant," she said. "If this is authenticated, it'll authenticate. The letterhead, the format, the internal memo numbering, it matches what I saw in internal documents during my time there. And 3 of the 4 names on the distribution list are still Vanguard employees. One of them might have kept a copy." She straightened up and looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not quite surprise. Something closer to the specific discomfort of someone who'd walked into a room expecting one problem and found a much larger one. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "I'm the CEO of the company that buried your work and took your career." Ethan considered the question. It was the second genuinely fair question she'd asked him today. "You're not the company yet," he said. "You came here, which is more than anyone else ever did. And I've been sitting on all of this for 10 years because I didn't know what to do with it, and 4 people are dead." He picked up the folder and handed it to her. "Those aren't complicated reasons. They're just the true ones." She took the folder. She stayed for 2.5 hours. By the time she left, the gray afternoon had gone to early dark, and Ethan's stomach reminded him that he'd skipped lunch. He locked up the shop, walked the 2 blocks to the diner on Clement Street, and ordered a burger and black coffee, and sat by the window watching the street while he ate. He thought about a woman named Sandra Purcell, whose name he'd seen in a news article about the recall. She'd been driving her daughter to a soccer tournament in October when her Vanguard Meridian dropped power on Route 30 at 68 miles an hour, and the car behind her hit her at full speed. Sandra had survived with injuries that the article described, with the particular discretion of journalism, as life-altering. Her daughter, who was 9 years old, had not survived. Ethan had read that article in February and then sat in his office for a while before going back to work. He didn't know what to do with that kind of information except carry it, and he'd been doing that since February, and it didn't get lighter. He ate the burger and drove home and slept badly, which was not new. Yet, the following week moved in increments. Victoria's office sent a secure email requesting specific documentation, particular VYNs from the ledger, particular dates, the hard drives from 2009 through 2014. Ethan made copies of everything before he sent anything, because that was simply how he operated, and he shipped the originals through a courier service the way the email specified. He expected silence for a while after that. What he got instead was a phone call on a Wednesday morning from a man named Dennis Archer. Dennis Archer was an attorney. He said this up front and then said he was calling on behalf of Richard Vail, and he said it in the smooth, unhurried manner of lawyers who have made calls like this many times and understand the specific power of patience in a conversation where the other person doesn't know what's coming. "Mr. Caldwell," Dennis said, "my client would like to open a line of communication with you regarding your recent discussions with Vanguard's current leadership." Ethan was in the office eating a granola bar. He put it down. "What kind of communication?" "My client believes there may have been some mischaracterization of historical decisions at the company that could be addressed through a more complete context. Is that the version where he explains how a memo with his name on it isn't actually a memo with his name on it? A pause, shorter than Victoria's pauses. My client has been in retirement for 4 years and has significant concerns about the reputational implications of documents being presented without context by parties who have a personal and financial interest in characterizing past events in a certain way. Tell your client, Ethan said, that he's welcome to come to my shop and talk to me directly. Same offer I made to the CEO. Mr. Caldwell, if he's got context that changes what that memo says, I'm interested in hearing it. I'm not interested in hearing it from you over the phone. Ethan picked the granola bar back up. Anything else? There was a long pause. We'll be in touch, Dennis Archer said, in a way that managed to be both a pleasantry and a warning. I'm sure you will, Ethan said, and hung up. He thought about it while he finished the granola bar. Then he went and pulled the folder with the Vail memo out of the filing cabinet and made 2 additional copies, putting one in a sealed envelope that he addressed to a lawyer in Columbus he'd spoken to briefly in March and never followed up with. He dropped it in the mail on his way to pick up a part. Small precautions. He'd learned the value of those. The pressure changed in April. It started the way these things usually do, not with a direct attack, but with a kind of ambient static that slowly becomes signal. A piece appeared in an automotive trade publication, the kind of article that's careful with its language but clear in its aim, suggesting that the engineering behind the recall might have been compromised by cost-cutting decisions driven by outside consultants rather than internal leadership failures. The piece quoted 2 anonymous sources described as former Vanguard executives. It also mentioned, in a paragraph near the end, that a private service operator in Ohio had received undisclosed payments from Vanguard-affiliated contractors for over a decade and might have had direct knowledge of the failure pattern without reporting it to regulators. It didn't name him. It didn't need to. Anyone who'd been following the recall story and looked at the geography would find Dunar and find Caldwell Auto within about 40 minutes. The calls started the day after the article ran. A few reporters, polite and professional, leaving messages he didn't return. One call from a man who identified himself as a stockholder and spent 4 minutes telling Ethan things about himself that weren't true. 2 calls from numbers that rang once and disconnected. He went about his work. Carl Bissett's truck got its torque converter replaced. It needed a full replacement, as Ethan had expected, and he charged Carl a fair price and spent an extra hour cleaning up some corrosion on the transmission housing that he threw in at no charge, because it bothered him to leave it. A woman named Patrice brought in a 2016 Kia with an oil leak that turned out to be a failed gasket and took a couple hours. A teenager from the high school asked if Ethan needed any help on weekends. He did, and had been meaning to hire someone part-time for 8 months, but he told the kid he'd think about it because he was mid-everything and didn't trust his own judgment about secondary decisions right now. What Ethan did not do was call his lawyer in Columbus, even though he probably should have. He told himself he'd do it next week, which was the same thing he'd told himself the week before, which was a pattern he recognized in himself and didn't love. He was under a Jeep Grand Cherokee on a Thursday afternoon, replacing a front axle shaft when the second Vanguard car came to his shop. This one was a company sedan, the kind of mid-grade black car that corporate fleets buy in bulk. The man who got out was Ethan's age, maybe a few years older, with silver hair and the particular fitness of someone who'd had money long enough to buy good habits. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than most of the tools in Ethan's shop. He stood in the lot and looked at the sign above the bay door with an expression that Ethan, watching from underneath the Jeep, identified as contempt that someone was trying to manage into something more neutral. Ethan slid out. "Help you?" he said. The man looked at him. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Richard Vail." Ethan stood up and didn't offer his hand because of the grease, and also because he didn't particularly want to shake Richard Vail's hand. "You came to Dinars," Ethan said. "I came to Dinar." Vail looked around the lot, the building, the sign with the uneven second A. "Nice shop." "It's a working shop. You want to come inside?" "I think outside is fine." Ethan leaned against the bay door and waited. Vail put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground for a moment in the studied way of someone constructing how they want to begin. "I want you to understand something," he said. What happened in 2007 was not simple. The decisions that were made involved considerations that you, at your level at the time, weren't fully in a position to understand. My level, Ethan said. The business realities. Vale looked up. There were 4,000 jobs tied to the VX7 launch timeline. There were dealer commitments, supplier contracts, a launch event that had been announced publicly. The failure scenario in your report required a specific combination of conditions that our testing suggested was extremely unlikely in normal operation. It wasn't unlikely enough, Ethan said. 4 people are dead. Vale's jaw tightened slightly. That is a tragedy. That is genuinely a tragedy, and I don't dismiss it. What do you want, Mr. Vale? I want you to understand that the memo you appear to have, the routing memo, is being taken out of context by people who have interests in seeing certain narratives stick. He was watching Ethan carefully. What that memo represents is a responsible attempt to manage known warranty issues through a specialized service network. It was not concealment, it was quality management. Quality management, Ethan said. The language in that document, without the operational context, the language in that document tells an outside mechanic to accept defective VX7 units and repair them and return them to the field and log nothing under the Vanguard service system. Ethan said it evenly, without raising his voice. That's what it says. Operational context doesn't change what it says. Vale was quiet for a moment. Something behind his eyes shifted. There are ways this can go, he said. For everyone. The investigation is still in early stages. There are decisions being made right now about the scope of what gets examined and what gets resolved through existing legal channels. He paused. You have a business here. You receive payments over 10 years from a contractor arrangement. Depending on how things are framed, a person in your position could find themselves characterized as a participant rather than a witness. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Are you threatening me? He said. I'm giving you context, Vale said. The same context I mentioned. Because it sounds like you're telling me that if I cooperate with the investigation, you'll find a way to make me look like I was part of the cover-up. I'm telling you that these situations are complex, and I documented everything, Ethan said. Every unit, every date, every communication. I documented it because I knew that someday someone was going to try to tell a version of this story where I was the problem instead of you. He straightened up from the bay door. So go ahead and frame it however you want. I've got 12 years of paperwork that tells a different story. Vale stared at him. The contempt was less managed now. Think carefully, Vale said. I've been thinking carefully for 16 years, Ethan said. You should go. Vale stood there for another moment, and Ethan had the feeling he was deciding something, running through versions of how this could continue. Then he turned and walked back to the company sedan and got in and drove out of the lot without another word. Ethan watched the car until it turned onto Mercer Road and disappeared. Then he went inside and called the lawyer in Columbus. The phone rang 3 times. Collins and Hartley, a woman answered. This is Ethan Caldwell, he said. I sent Daniel Collins a letter. I need to talk to him today if possible. He got put on hold for almost 4 minutes. Mr. Caldwell, a man's voice came on. I've been waiting to hear from you. I know, Ethan said. I should have called sooner. You should have called sooner, Daniel Collins agreed without being unkind about it. Tell me what's happening. Ethan sat down in his office chair, and it creaked the way it always did, the way he'd been meaning to fix for about 2 years. He looked out at the bay where the Jeep Grand Cherokee was still up on stands with one front axle removed, waiting for him. A man named Richard Vale just came to my shop, Ethan said. And he told me, without quite saying it, that he's going to try to make me look like a co-conspirator if I keep cooperating with the investigation. Okay, Collins said. Calm, professional. Like this was a Tuesday, which it was. I have documentation of everything, Ethan said. Everything I just described and more. I know, I read the letter. A pause. Here's what I need you to do. From this point forward, you don't talk to anyone from Vanguard, anyone from Vale's camp, or any journalist without calling me first. Can you do that? Yes. Good. I'm going to need to see everything. Originals, copies, the ledgers, the hard drives, everything you have. I've already sent copies to Vanguard's current legal team, Ethan said. That's fine. I need my own set. When can you come to Columbus? Ethan looked at the Jeep. I've got a Cherokee I need to finish. Tomorrow then. Tomorrow afternoon, Ethan said. I'll be there by 2. He hung up and sat for a minute in the quiet of the office. The fluorescent light above him had been flickering for about 6 weeks. A ballast issue, easy fix, something he kept not getting to. It buzzed faintly in the silence. He thought about Richard Vale standing in his lot, expensive jacket, managed expression, the specific confidence of a man who had spent his career making problems disappear and assumed this one would behave the same way. He thought about the green ledgers on the shelf and the hard drives in the fireproof box and 18 pages of engineering report that had been buried for 16 years. Then he got up, went back to the bay, and finished the axle. Daniel Collins worked out of a building on North High Street in Columbus that had the faded look of a firm that had been there long enough to stop caring about first impressions. 3rd floor, no elevator, a waiting room with chairs that didn't match, and a receptionist named Gloria, who had clearly heard everything and was impressed by none of it. Ethan sat there for 12 minutes with a cardboard box on his lap before Collins came out to get him. Collins was mid-50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of permanently rumpled quality that suggested he'd been in court recently or was about to be. His handshake was quick and businesslike. He looked at the box and then at Ethan and said, "Is that everything?" "No," Ethan said. "This is a representative sample. The rest is in my storage room. I wasn't going to put 12 years of documentation in a car without knowing who I was dealing with." Collins looked at him for a second. "Fair enough. Come on back." The office was cluttered in the functional way of someone who knew where everything was, even if no one else could figure it out. Collins cleared a chair of 3 manila folders and waved Ethan into it and sat down across from him and opened the box. He went through it slowly. He didn't make notes right away. He just read, the way a doctor reads a chart, looking for the shape of the problem before he got into the specifics. Ethan sat and waited, which he was reasonably good at. After about 20 minutes, Collins set down the Vale memo and took his glasses off his forehead and put them on properly and picked it back up and read it again. "This is the original copy?" he said. "Third-generation photocopy of the original. I've never had the original." "How confident are you in its authenticity?" "The formatting matches internal documents from that period that I handled directly. The memo numbering system is consistent with the convention they used in product development. 3 of the 4 names on the distribution list are still Vanguard employees. And Richard Vale just drove to Dunar and threatened me 2 days ago, which is not the behavior of someone who's relaxed about the document's existence." Collins set the memo down. "What exactly did he say?" Ethan told him. He was precise about it. He'd been replaying the conversation since it happened, and he had a good memory for the specific language people used when they were being carefully indirect. Collins listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Collins said, "You understand he didn't technically threaten you." "I understand he was deliberate about that." "Right." Collins tapped the memo with one finger. "He's going to argue this was standard warranty routing, that the memo represents a normal business decision to use an external service network for quality management, not an attempt to conceal defects from regulators." That's what he said, more or less. His problem is that the criteria in this memo map exactly to the failure mode in your 2007 report, which means either he was routing units to external shops because of a specific known failure he'd declined to address, which is concealment, or it's a coincidence of extraordinary specificity. Collins looked at Ethan over his glasses. "Juries don't like that kind of coincidence." "Are we talking about a jury?" Ethan said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. Cases like this usually settle before they get anywhere near a courtroom. But the threat of a jury is what moves these things." Collins leaned back. "Here's where you stand. You were a legitimate contractor. You received payment for legitimate repair work. You documented everything. The fact that you didn't report to NHTSA is a problem, but it's a problem for you, not a crime. You had no regulatory obligation to report as a private service operator, especially given the layered contractor arrangement that obscured the Vanguard connection." Victoria's legal team made the same point, Ethan said. Victoria's legal team is right. They're also managing a company with several $100 million in liability exposure and a board that's going to want to minimize that exposure in whatever direction is cheapest. Collins looked at him steadily. That means at some point their interests and your interests may not be identical. I want you to understand that before we go any further. Ethan nodded. He'd thought about this. What I need from you, Collins continued, is access to everything in that storage room. I need to be able to go through the complete record before anyone else talks to you officially. NHTSA, congressional staff, plaintiff attorneys. Because once those conversations start, you need to be protected. He paused. And you need to stop talking to anyone from Vanguard without me present. Vale's attorney called before Vale showed up in person, Ethan said. A man named Dennis Archer. Collins wrote the name down. Don't return that call if it comes again. Everything goes through me. He closed the box. I'm going to be honest with you about something else. There's probably money in this for you, either through a settlement or through a whistleblower mechanism if this goes the regulatory route. I'm not going to pretend that's not a factor. It's not why I'm here, Ethan said. I know it's not, but it's going to be part of how the other side characterizes your motivation. Vale's people are going to say you're doing this for financial gain. I want you prepared for that narrative. Let them say it, Ethan said. I spent 16 years keeping records that cost me nothing and gained me nothing. If that's the behavior of someone motivated by money, their theory of motivation needs some work. Collins almost smiled. Okay, can you be back here next Tuesday with everything from the storage room? I can be here Monday, Ethan said. He drove back to Dunar in the early evening, the highway gray and flat and lit orange by a setting sun that had waited all day to be interesting. He stopped at the grocery store on 36 and bought enough food for a week because he'd been forgetting to do that recently, and he drove the last 4 miles to his house thinking about things he couldn't do much about right now. The house was a 2-bedroom on Cartwright Street, bought 12 years ago for less than it would have cost to rent a decent apartment in Columbus. He'd fixed most of the things that needed fixing over the years, the plumbing, the wiring, a roof situation that had been urgent and expensive, but there were parts of the place he'd never gotten around to. A back bedroom that was still just boxes and old equipment, a kitchen renovation he'd started once and abandoned halfway through when a major job came into the shop. The half-finished renovation had become so normal to him that he stopped seeing it, which was probably not a good sign about anything. He made a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table and didn't turn the TV on. The thing he kept returning to, the thing Collins had put words to that Ethan had been carrying without quite naming, was the question of what the 4 people got out of any of this. Sandra Purcell's daughter. The other 3, whose names and faces he'd looked up because he felt like he owed them at least that. A retired school teacher from Akron named Dennis Whaley. A 23-year-old named Corey Pratt, who'd just started a job in Pittsburgh and was driving home for Thanksgiving. A woman named Gloria Chen, who'd been a pharmacist for 30 years and was 18 months from retirement. 4 people with actual lives who'd driven cars with his architecture in them, carrying a fault he'd found and reported, and been punished for reporting. He didn't eat much of the sandwich. The second trade publication piece ran on a Friday, and this one was less careful about its language. The headline was, Dunar Mechanics' decade-long relationship with Vanguard contractor raises questions about recall timeline. The piece laid out the contract arrangement clearly enough. Ethan's shop, Tercel Distribution, the routing of VX series units over 10 years, and then applied the specific kind of framing that lets a reporter imply something without stating it, using phrases like raises questions and investigators are expected to examine, and the nature of the arrangement remains unclear. His name appeared 11 times in 9 paragraphs. His phone started in the morning and didn't stop. The teenager who'd asked about weekend work, his name was Marcus, Ethan remembered, Marcus Teal, showed up at the shop at noon and asked if he still needed help. Under most circumstances, Ethan would have put him off again. Instead, he said yes, showed him where the broom was, and spent 40 minutes explaining how he answered the phone and which calls got through and which ones didn't. What do I say if they ask if you're here? Marcus asked. Say Mr. Caldwell is with a customer and will return calls as his schedule allows. Are you ever going to return them? Some of them, Ethan said. Keep the list. The reporters he didn't return. The 2 calls from plaintiff attorneys he forwarded to Collins, who had apparently already been expecting them. One call was from a woman named Helen Marsh, who identified herself as an investigator with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and that one Ethan returned within the hour. Helen Marsh had the voice of someone who'd been doing government work long enough to have lost the ability to sound surprised by anything. She was professional and unhurried and asked Ethan if he'd be willing to have a conversation with her team in the next week or two at his convenience, and Ethan told her he'd need to have his attorney present, and she said that was completely fine, and they settled on a date. When he hung up and told Collins, Collins said, "Good. That's actually good. NHTSA contact puts you in the witness category officially. Vail's people lose a lot of leverage the moment you're talking to a federal regulator." "He's still going to try to make the narrative stick," Ethan said. "That I was part of it." "He's going to try. But here's his problem, Teo. Your documentation is meticulous and it runs in one direction. Every entry in those ledgers, every invoice, every record tells the story of a man documenting a problem, not profiting from one. The only thing he can argue is that you should have acted sooner, and that's a moral critique, not a legal one." Collins paused. "It's still going to be uncomfortable." "I know," Ethan said. It was uncomfortable. The following week, a local TV crew from Dayton showed up at the shop unannounced. Ethan came out of the bay, saw the camera, and said, "No comment," and went back inside and locked the front door for the first time in 11 years. Marcus watched the camera crew stand in the lot for 20 minutes before they gave up and left. "Does this happen a lot?" Marcus asked. "No," Ethan said. "First time." "Are you in trouble?" Ethan looked at the teenager, who was 17 and had a specific earnest quality that Ethan found he liked. "I'm not in trouble," he said. "Some people would like me to be in trouble. That's a different thing." Marcus seemed to think about this. "What did you do?" "I kept records," Ethan said. "For a long time. Now people are upset about what the records show." "Who's upset?" "People who thought the records didn't exist," Ethan said, and left it there. Tucked. The meeting where everything nearly came undone happened on a Thursday in the 3rd week of May, in a conference room on the 12th floor of a building in downtown Columbus that housed the law firm handling Vanguard's internal investigation. Ethan was there with Collins. Victoria was there with 3 attorneys, and a woman named Barbara Osei, who was the company's outside investigative counsel. There was a court reporter in the corner and coffee on a side table that nobody touched. The first 2 hours were orderly. Barbara Osei went through Ethan's documentation methodically: the ledgers, the hard drives, the engineering report, the 2007 meeting receipt document, asking precise questions that Ethan answered precisely, and Collins intervened twice when the questions drifted toward territory he wanted more specificity on before Ethan answered. It was the kind of meeting that felt productive in the way that meticulous, slow work feels productive, accumulating detail and verification in layers. Then a door opened and a man Ethan didn't recognize came in and handed Barbara Osei a piece of paper and left. Osei read the paper. Her expression didn't change much, but something did. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I need to ask you about something." She put the paper flat on the table. "Are you aware that Richard Vail has provided a sworn statement to his own legal team alleging that you contacted him directly in 2014 and offered to suppress your documentation in exchange for payment?" The room went quiet in a specific way. Ethan looked at the paper without touching it. Then he looked at Osei. "No," he said, "because it didn't happen." "He has a record of a phone call from a cell number registered to—" "I want to see the phone record," Collins said immediately. He was already sitting forward. "We've requested it from Mr. Vail's counsel. It should be—" "I want to see it before we go further," Collins said. "What number?" Osei looked at the paper. She read out a number. Ethan shook his head slowly. "That's not my number. That's never been my number. I've had the same cell number since 2009. He looked at Collins. "You have it." Collins checked his phone and read the number aloud. It didn't match. Someone called Richard Vale in 2014 from a number he's representing as mine, Ethan said. That's not the same thing as me calling him. Victoria, who had said almost nothing in 2 hours, spoke for the first time. Can the number be traced? Cell records from 2014 are available if the carrier complied with retention schedules, Collins said. I'm going to want a subpoena on that number's registration history. He was writing. Who made this allegation? When was the statement taken? The statement was filed this morning, Osei said. Collins set his pen down. He looked at Ethan, and Ethan could read the look. Not doubt, but calibration. The specific recalibration of someone adjusting their understanding of who they're up against. Vale waited, Collins said. He let us get 2 hours into this before his people filed the statement. He was watching to see what we had. And now he knows, Victoria said. And now he knows, Collins agreed. He looked at Osei. I want everything you have on the statement filed this morning. I want it today. And I want it understood that this meeting is suspended pending our review of that material. There was a brief, quiet negotiation between the attorneys in the room about procedure and timeline. Ethan sat through it. He was aware of a low hum of something in his chest that wasn't quite anger. It was older and more tired than anger. It was the specific feeling of watching someone take a cheap shot and knowing you have to respond to it anyway, on their timeline, in their terms, because that's how the game works even when the game is being played badly. The meeting adjourned. Collins and Ethan walked to the elevator in silence. In the lobby, Collins said quietly, How worried are you about that phone record? I'm not worried about it, Ethan said. I know I didn't make that call. Whatever that number is, it isn't mine, and it wasn't. Okay. Collins pushed the lobby door open. The afternoon outside was bright enough to make both of them squint. Then here's what matters. He's playing defense now, not offense. You don't fabricate evidence when you're winning. You fabricate evidence when you need to stop something you can't stop otherwise. He paused on the sidewalk. That means he's scared. That should make me feel better, Ethan said. Doesn't it? Not particularly, Ethan said. Scared people do unpredictable things. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Traffic moved on the street in the normal way of cities in the afternoon, entirely indifferent. I need you to think, Collins said, about whether there is anyone at all, who might have had access to your phone in 2014. A shop employee, a contractor, a family member. Anyone who could have used your number or spoofed it, Ethan thought. I didn't have employees in 2014. I did most of the work myself, brought in day labor for bigger jobs. No one had regular access. What about spoofing? Someone creating a call record that looks like it originated from your number. I don't know enough about how that works to say. I do, Collins said, and if Vale's people generated a spoofed record, finding that is going to take some technical work, expensive work. He looked at Ethan. I want to be transparent. This just got more complicated than I initially assessed. I know, Ethan said. You okay? Ethan considered the question with the literal attention he gave most questions. I'm fine, he said. I've been doing this for 16 years. I can keep doing it. He didn't say the rest of it. That fine was a different thing from okay, and that okay was somewhere further down the road than he could see right now. He kept that part. He drove back to Dunar. Marcus had closed up the shop, which he'd only been shown how to do once and had apparently figured out correctly. The bay was clean, the tools were where they were supposed to be, and there was a note on the workbench that said 3 people had called about appointments and 1 person had called and not left a message. Ethan read the note. He put it in the office on the pile of other things he needed to deal with. He sat in his chair, and the light above him buzzed its familiar flicker, and he looked at the storage room with the door closed. The thing about documentation, the thing he'd always understood and never quite articulated, was that it didn't protect you from the fight. It just gave you something real to fight with. You still had to show up, and the other side still got their shots, and there were still going to be days when the whole weight of it sat on your chest like something you couldn't see. This was one of those days. He didn't leave the office right away. He sat in the flickering light for a while and thought about Dennis Whaley and Corey Pratt and Gloria Chen and a 9-year-old girl who was going to a soccer tournament, and he let that sit with him the way he always let it sit with him, without trying to do anything useful with it, because sometimes a thing just needed to be carried. Then he got up, turned off the light, The buzzing stopped and drove home. He ate something he didn't pay attention to and went to bed at 9:30, which was early for him, and lay in the dark with the particular alertness of someone whose brain has decided sleep is a negotiation rather than a destination. At some point after midnight, his phone lit up on the nightstand. He looked at it. A text from Collins. "Call me when you're up. Found something in the 2014 phone records. Think it's good news. Don't get ahead of it yet." Ethan set the phone face down and stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep much after that, but it was a different kind of awake than before. Less weight, more something else. The kind of alertness that comes when a thing you've been carrying for a long time starts to feel like it might be putting itself down. He watched the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around him the way old houses do, ticking and shifting in the quiet. Outside on Cartwright Street, a dog barked once and then stopped. Morning was several hours away. He waited for it. Collins called at 7:15 before Ethan had finished his first cup of coffee. "The number Vale's team submitted," Collins said, no preamble. "The one they claimed was yours. We pulled the carrier registration history." Ethan set his mug down. "And?" "It was a prepaid phone, purchased at a convenience store in Westerville, Ohio in August 2014. Cash transaction, no ID on file. The phone made 11 calls over a 3-week period and was never activated again." Collins paused. "One of those calls went to a number registered to Richard Vale's personal cell account." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Someone bought a burner phone and called Vale, and Vale is representing it as me. That's what the record suggests. Now, to be precise, we can't prove Vale knew the call wasn't from you. His lawyers will argue he received a call. The caller identified themselves as Ethan Caldwell, and he had no reason to question it. But the call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Collins said, and in his sworn statement, Vale described a detailed negotiation about the terms of suppressing your documentation. A negotiation that specific does not happen in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The timeline doesn't work." Ethan sat with that. Outside, Cartwright Street was starting its morning. A car going past, someone's trash bins rolling on the concrete. "He embellished," Ethan said, "significantly. And now we have a sworn statement that contradicts the phone record he himself submitted." Collins' voice had the controlled quality of someone keeping satisfaction at a professional distance. "I've already prepared a motion to strike the statement, and I'm requesting sanctions for submitting fabricated evidence in a federal investigation. Dennis Archer is going to have a very bad week." What does this do to Vale's position overall? It damages him, badly. A man who fabricates evidence to protect himself from an investigation is not a man who looks innocent of the underlying conduct. Juries understand that instinctively, and so do federal investigators, and so does the press. Collins paused. "There's something else. Barbara Osei's team found a second document overnight. One of the 3 Vanguard employees on Vale's 2009 distribution list, a man named Thomas Greer, been with the company 31 years. He kept a copy of the routing memo in his personal files. His original, not a photocopy." Ethan closed his eyes for a second. "Thomas Greer kept it," he said. 31 years, Collins said. "Apparently he's been sitting on it since 2009 waiting for exactly this. He came forward voluntarily when Osei's team contacted him last week. He's prepared to testify that he received the memo, understood it as an instruction to route known defective units outside the official warranty system, and raised concerns internally that were dismissed." A pause. "He also has email records from 2009 in which he specifically asked Vale whether the routing protocol needed to be disclosed to regulators. Vale's written response told him it did not." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's the thing," Ethan said, almost to himself. "That's the thing," Collins agreed. Vale in writing, telling an employee that a protocol designed to manage known defective engines did not need to be disclosed to federal safety regulators. That is not a gray area. He let that sit for a moment. "The investigation is moving to a formal phase. NHTSA is escalating to the Department of Justice. I got a call this morning from a federal prosecutor named Anita Reyes who wants to talk to you next week." "Okay," Ethan said. "I'll be there. You don't say a word without me in the room." "I know." Ethan picked his coffee back up. It had gone lukewarm. "Daniel, what happens to Vale?" Collins was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a lawyer choosing how honest to be. If the DOJ moves forward, and the Greer emails are as clean as they appear to be, he's looking at obstruction, potentially wire fraud, and whatever the prosecutors can build on the regulatory concealment side. These cases take time. Nothing happens fast. "I know that," Ethan said. "But it moves," Collins said. "It's moving now." Ethan drank the lukewarm coffee and thought about Thomas Greer, who he'd never met, a man who'd spent 31 years at a company and kept a single piece of paper in his personal files because something in him knew it mattered. That was its own kind of documentation, the quiet, private decision to hold on to a thing that might someday be needed. He understood that instinct completely. The federal hearing was set for the second week of June, in a building in Columbus that had the specific institutional weight of a place where things were decided and not argued about anymore. Not a courtroom, a formal investigative proceeding with NHTSA investigators, 2 federal prosecutors from Anita Reyes' office, and a congressional staff member from the Senate Commerce Committee who had flown in from Washington and looked slightly jet-lagged. Ethan arrived with Collins and a rolling cart with 4 archive boxes. He wore the same jacket he'd worn to every serious meeting in the last 6 years, a dark gray thing that fit well enough and didn't try too hard. Collins had suggested he buy something new. Ethan had said he'd think about it and then hadn't. The room was a long conference table, government issue, with too many chairs and not enough natural light. Anita Reyes was 43, compact, with close-cropped hair and the economical manner of someone who had learned to say exactly what was necessary and nothing more. She greeted Ethan with a handshake and no warmth, which he respected. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "we appreciate your cooperation." "I've been trying to cooperate for 16 years, Ethan said. "Nice to have a room to do it in." She almost smiled. "Not quite. We're going to go through your documentation chronologically. We'll start with the 2007 engineering report and move forward. I want you to walk us through each document in your own words. What it is, how it was created, what you understood it to show, and how you came to have it." "Understood," Ethan said. "This will probably take most of the day." "That's fine," Ethan said. I cleared my schedule. It took most of the day. Ethan had talked about this material in fragments, to Collins, to Victoria, to Barbara Osai. But he'd never laid it out in complete sequence before, beginning to end, in a room where people were writing everything down. There was something different about doing it that way. It had a weight and a shape it didn't have in pieces. He started with the architecture. He explained the VX7 engine design, the way an engineer explains things, from the structure outward, tracing the logic of each decision and where that logic had been sound and where it had carried a hidden condition. He wasn't showing off. He was just precise, and precision in this context was its own kind of argument. The congressional staffer, a young man named Paul, who had the look of someone very recently out of law school, interrupted twice with questions that revealed he didn't quite understand the mechanics. Ethan answered both questions without condescension, walking back to the fundamental principle each time until the man nodded. Anita Reyes watched this without expression. Then he moved to the 2007 report. He walked through the failure mode, the parameters, the simulations. He described the meeting, the 3 lawyers, Gerald Stokes, the specific language they'd used, the document they'd produced to acknowledge receipt without committing to action. He put the receipt document on the table. "This was produced for you at the meeting?" Reyes said. "It was produced while I waited in a conference room for 40 minutes. I asked for written acknowledgement that I'd submitted the report. This was what they gave me." "And you kept it?" "I kept everything," Ethan said, "from that day forward." She picked it up and looked at it, set it down carefully in a way that suggested it was going into evidence. They broke for lunch at 12:30. Ethan ate a sandwich from a paper bag Collins had brought. Turkey, not his first choice, but food. And they sat in a side room and Collins reviewed his notes and said, "You're doing well. Stay at the same pace this afternoon." "I'm not performing," Ethan said. "I know. That's why it's working." The afternoon was harder. The afternoon was the Vale memo, the ledgers, the tercel distribution invoices, and the question Ethan knew was coming and had been thinking about how to answer since March. Anita Reyes asked it directly, which he respected. Mr. Caldwell, you were receiving units connected to a known safety defect from 2012 onward. That's your own documentation. You were repairing those units and returning them to service. You had reason to believe, based on the 2007 report and your own direct experience with the failure modes, that these vehicles represented a potential safety risk to the public. She looked at him steadily. Why didn't you contact NHTSA? Collins said. I'd like... No, Ethan said. It's okay. I'll answer it. Collins sat back. Ethan looked at Reyes. Because I told myself I was still gathering evidence, that I needed a more complete record before I brought it to anyone official. He paused. That was true, and it was also convenient. The money from the contract work was steady, and I didn't have other income that replaced it. And I understood clearly that the moment I contacted a federal agency, all of that stopped, and I was in a fight with a $12 billion company. He kept his eyes on her. I made a calculation that I told myself was strategic, and that was also partially self-interested. I know that. I've known that since February when I read about the 4 fatalities. He paused. I don't have a better answer than that. It's the honest one. The room was quiet. The congressional staffer was writing. The NHTSA investigator, a man who had not introduced himself by name and had asked no questions so far, was watching Ethan with the particular attentiveness of someone filing things away. Reyes made a small note. Thank you for being direct about that. It's all I've got, Ethan said. The proceeding concluded at 4:50. Ethan signed 3 sets of documentation releases and shook hands with Reyes and walked out of the building into a June afternoon that was warm in the specific way of Ohio in early summer, humid at the edges, the sky a pale washed-out blue. Collins walked beside him to the parking garage. For what it's worth, Collins said, that answer about why you didn't report, the honest version, that's better for you legally than a polished explanation would have been. I wasn't thinking about what was better for me, Ethan said. I know. That's also better for you. Collins looked at him. The Greer material goes to the grand jury next month. Reyes's office is moving fast on this, faster than I expected. I think they have more than they've shown us. What do you think they have? My guess? More Vanguard employees who've been sitting on things and are ready to talk now that the structure has started moving. Collins unlocked his car. These situations work that way. One person comes forward, it gets real, and then others decide the risk of staying quiet is higher than the risk of talking. Ethan thought about Thomas Greer again. 31 years. A single piece of paper. Does Vail know how bad it is? Ethan asked. His lawyers know. Whether he's let himself understand it yet is a different question. Collins opened his car door. I've seen people in his position hold on to the idea that it's going to turn around until about 48 hours before it doesn't. The psychology of it is, they've spent their careers making problems go away. They believe right up until the end that this one will go away too. Ethan nodded. He thought that was probably accurate. He drove back to Dunar and got to the shop at 6:30, which was after closing, and let himself in through the side door and stood in the bay for a minute in the half-light. The Jeep Cherokee had been picked up 2 weeks ago. There was a Subaru Outback in Bay 1 with a coolant leak he was midway through, and an older Ford F-150 in Bay 2 waiting for a wheel bearing. The shop smelled the way it always smelled, oil and metal, and the faint rubber scent of tires. And it was quiet in the way it was only quiet after hours, without Marcus's radio and the sound of the street coming through the open door. He checked the Subaru coolant reservoir level. He'd been monitoring a slow seep at the upper hose junction, and made a note in his work log and covered it back up. It occurred to him, standing there, that he'd been in 2 completely different worlds today. One of them was federal investigators and legal strategy, and 16 years of documentation being processed into the language of liability and regulatory violation. The other one was a coolant leak on a 2018 Subaru that a woman named Denise needed back by Friday because she drove it to her second job. Both of them were real. Both of them were his. He locked up and went home. Victoria called the following morning while he was eating breakfast. "I heard from Barbara Osei," she said, "about yesterday." "How much did she tell you?" "Enough. She said it went well." A pause. "She also told me about Thomas Greer." "Greer," Ethan said. "Do you know him?" "I've met him twice since I came in as CEO. He works in logistics coordination. Quiet man. 31 years. Victoria paused. When Osei told me he'd kept the original memo, I didn't know what to do with that information for about an hour. "What did you do with it after the hour?" "I called him," she said. "I thanked him. He didn't say much. I don't think he's a man who says much. He just said he figured it would come up eventually." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. About all the people inside that company who knew something was wrong and stayed quiet. Most of them probably told themselves it wasn't their responsibility, that someone else would handle it, that the company had processes for these things." "And Greer kept the paper," Ethan said. "And you kept the ledgers," Victoria said. "You're more alike than you probably know." Ethan thought about that. He'd never considered himself particularly similar to anyone. It was one of those things that the circumstances of his life had maybe reinforced. But the image of Thomas Greer in a file room somewhere, sliding a piece of paper into his personal folder in 2009, making a quiet, unwitnessed decision to hold on to something that mattered, that landed in a specific place. "What's happening with the board?" he asked. "The board is managing its panic." Her voice was dry in the way of someone who had run out of patience for a particular kind of person. "Two members want to settle everything as fast as possible and draw a line around the current leadership's liability. Two members want to fight the DOJ investigation because they think it can be contained. The remaining four are waiting to see which way the wind goes." She paused. "What I'm trying to do is keep the company functional while the legal process runs, which is harder than it sounds when you have a stock price that's down 40% and a recall that's still being administered." "Is the company going to survive it?" Ethan asked. "Ask me in 18 months, she said. "Today? I don't know. The product line is still good underneath all of this. The current engineering team is strong. If we can get through the legal exposure and come out the other side with something real to offer, there's a path." She paused again. "I'm telling you this not because I need you to care about Vanguard's financial future. I'm telling you because the people who still work there, most of them, didn't do this." "I know," Ethan said. "That's not a small thing." There was a moment of quiet on the line. "There's something I need to tell you," Victoria said. "As part of the internal remediation process, the restructuring of how we document engineering risk going forward, I've been reviewing the original VX7 architecture files, the ones that were reclassified when your access was revoked." She paused carefully. "The authorship metadata on those files, Mr. Caldwell, on the core architecture documents, it's still there. It was never scrubbed." Ethan set his fork down. "What it shows," Victoria continued, "is that the primary architect of the VX7 engine platform was an engineer who left the company in 2008. The files were reassigned under a different employee name in the official record, but the creation metadata, the timestamps, the original author tags, they still carry your name." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Someone tried to remove you from the record and missed the metadata," he said. "Yes. Whoever did it apparently didn't understand how the file system worked at that level." She paused. "Or didn't think anyone would ever look." Ethan sat with that for a long time. 12 years of being the mechanic in Dunar, and underneath the surface of a document server somewhere in a Vanguard facility, his name had been sitting in a timestamp the entire time. A small, technical, indestructible fact. "What does that mean practically?" he asked. "It means we can demonstrate clearly that the engineering foundation of the VX7 was your work, which has implications for the internal record and for, eventually, depending on how everything resolves, how your contribution is formally characterized." She chose her words deliberately. "I can't make promises about timeline or outcome, but I wanted you to know that the record is there." "Okay," he said. "That's all you're going to say?" "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know," Victoria said. "Maybe something more than okay." It doesn't change what happened, Ethan said. It's useful, and I'm glad you found it, but it doesn't give back the 16 years. He paused. Okay is what I've got right now. She was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, she said. The second week of June moved the way consequential things move. Not dramatically, but with the specific momentum of a process that has found its footing and is no longer asking permission. Collins filed the motion to strike Vale's fabricated statement, and the opposing counsel's response was notably thin. They didn't defend the timeline inconsistency because they couldn't, and what they offered instead was procedural language about the context of sworn statements that convinced no one. The DOJ subpoenas went out on a Thursday. Ethan knew because Collins called to tell him, and because that night the trade publication that had run both negative pieces about him published a brief update noting that the investigation had entered a formal federal phase and that Richard Vale had retained criminal defense counsel. Vale's attorney, not Dennis Archer now, but a more expensive firm from Cincinnati, issued a public statement saying that Mr. Vale had fully cooperated with all inquiries and was confident the facts would vindicate his record of leadership. It was the statement that lawyers write when the facts are not going to vindicate anything, and everyone involved knows it. Ethan read it on his phone in the office, late, after Marcus had gone home. He thought about what Collins had said about people in Vale's position, that they believe right up until the end that the problem will go away. He thought about the man who had stood in his parking lot in an expensive jacket and talked about business realities and 4,000 jobs, as though the arithmetic of employment could account for Sandra Purcell's daughter. He wasn't satisfied by any of this. He'd expected to feel something cleaner, some version of resolution that matched the scale of what had happened. What he felt instead was tired in a very specific way, and sad about the parts that couldn't be fixed, and cautiously, carefully aware that something was moving in the right direction. Those three things at the same time, which wasn't the same as satisfaction, but was probably the honest version of it. The fluorescent light in the office had finally been replaced. He'd done it himself, a 15-minute job that had taken him 3 years to get to, and now the light was steady and silent, and it changed the whole quality of the room in a way he found faintly disorienting. He sat under the new light for a while with the day's paperwork in front of him, and did what he always did. He worked through the stack, methodically, one thing at a time, until the desk was clear. Then he locked up and drove home through the Dunar night, which was warm now and smelled like cut grass and distant rain, and he pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a minute before going inside. In the morning, there would be a coolant issue on the Subaru to finish, a wheel bearing on the F-150 to replace, and a 2014 Honda Accord coming in at 9 that the owner thought needed a transmission flush, but Ethan suspected actually needed a solenoid. There was a deposition Collins wanted to prep him for, scheduled in 2 weeks. There was a letter from NHTSA that had arrived that afternoon that he hadn't opened yet. He got out of the car and went inside. The letter could wait until morning. He'd learned over 16 years that some things you looked at better with a night's sleep behind you, not because the contents changed, but because you were clear about what they meant when you weren't carrying the whole weight of the day at the same time. He made tea he didn't really want and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark backyard, and the half-finished renovation was behind him in the kitchen, and he noticed it the way he always noticed it and thought he should really get back to that. And this time, for no reason he could explain, it felt like something he might actually do. The letter from NHTSA sat on Ethan's kitchen table for 2 days before he opened it. Not because he was afraid of it, more because he'd trained himself over 16 years to be deliberate about which things he gave his immediate attention to and which ones he made wait, and federal correspondence in the middle of an active investigation felt like something that deserved a clear head rather than a late-night kitchen read. So he left it there, weighted down by a coffee mug on Tuesday and a set of keys on Wednesday, and he went about the work in between. He finished the Subaru coolant job. The upper hose junction had been seeping at a pinhole that a pressure test confirmed. Simple fix, 40 minutes, including cleanup. He replaced the F-150's wheel bearing, which turned out to be worse than the owner had described, the inner race having started to corrugate in a way that would have become genuinely dangerous in another few months. He told the owner that, plainly, without dramatizing it. The owner, a retired county road worker named Gene, said, "How bad was it really?" And Ethan said, "Another 4 or 5 months, and you'd have known about it on the highway." And Gene went quiet in the way people go quiet when they understand something narrowly avoided. The Honda Accord came in on Thursday. It was the solenoid, as Ethan had suspected. He replaced it, drove the car around the block twice, charged the owner a fair price, and sent her off. Marcus had started showing up 20 minutes early every day, which Ethan had noticed and not commented on. The kid worked clean and asked good questions, and he'd stop checking his phone every 10 minutes, which was the real sign that someone was settling in. Ethan paid him in cash at the end of each week and had started teaching him how to read a diagnostic report rather than just run the tool, because running the tool was easy and reading what it actually meant was the part that took years. "You went to school for engineering?" Marcus asked on Thursday afternoon, watching Ethan annotate a printout with a pencil. "Ohio State," Ethan said. "Mechanical engineering. And now you fix cars." Ethan looked up. "I've always fixed things." The engineering was a longer version of the same thing. He went back to the printout. "What do you want to do?" Marcus shrugged in the way of 17-year-olds who haven't let themselves want things too specifically yet because it feels like a liability. "I don't know. Maybe something with cars, maybe not." "Either's fine," Ethan said. "Just get good at something real. Something where you can look at the work when it's done and know whether it's right or wrong. Those skills hold up." He paused. "Stay away from anything where the only measure of success is what other people think of you." Marcus didn't say anything, but he was listening in the way young people listen when something lands, even if they're not ready to acknowledge it yet. Ethan set the printout down. "Go clean the air filter on the Chevy in Bay 2. I'll show you how to check it properly." He opened the NHTSA letter on Thursday evening. It was formal and precise in the way federal documents are, and it required 2 readings to extract the actual substance from the procedural language. What it said, in plain terms, was that the investigation into Vanguard Motors' handling of the VX7 platform had been formally expanded to include a review of the company's internal engineering documentation processes, and that Ethan's cooperation and documentation had been designated as central to the regulatory record. It also said, in language so careful it almost obscured the point, that his early identification of the failure mode and formal internal report had been recognized in the investigative record, and that the agency was grateful for his contribution to public safety. Grateful for his contribution to public safety. He read that sentence 3 times. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel when the official version of things finally acknowledged what he'd done 16 years ago. Something more, maybe. Or something different. What he actually felt was a quiet, tired recognition, like finally getting a receipt for something you paid for a long time ago and had mostly stopped expecting. He put the letter on the kitchen table and made dinner and ate it while the evening came through the window, and he thought about the gap between what official language says and what the actual human experience of a thing is, and how those 2 things almost never fully connect. The letter said contribution to public safety. What it meant was 4 years of work, 1 honest report, a meeting with 3 lawyers, 11 years of rebuilding from the bottom up, a storage room full of green ledgers, and a long time being the only person who knew the whole story. You couldn't fit that in a federal document. You weren't supposed to. That wasn't what federal documents were for. He did the dishes and went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than he had in months. The grand jury proceedings ran through July and into August. Ethan testified once in early July in a room with 12 people who looked at him with the varying levels of attention that juries bring to things, some of them closely focused. One older woman in the back row who seemed to be weighing each word before she let it settle. 2 people who he could tell were tracking the overall shape of the story rather than the individual pieces. He answered every question the same way he always answered questions. Directly, with precision, without editorializing, going back to the fundamental principle when something needed clarification. Afterward, in the hallway, Anita Reyes said to Collins, "Your client gives consistent testimony." "He's a consistent person," Collins said. Reyes looked at Ethan. "That's rarer than it should be." Ethan shook her hand and went home and replaced the chain above the bay door that had been swinging loose in weather since approximately 2021. It took 20 minutes. He'd been meaning to do it for 3 years. The indictment came down in August. Richard Vale was charged on 4 counts: obstruction of a federal safety investigation, wire fraud, conspiracy to suppress material safety information, and filing a fraudulent statement in a federal proceeding, the last count stemming directly from the fabricated phone record. Dennis Archer, Vale's original attorney, was separately referred to the state bar for professional conduct review. The Cincinnati firm that had replaced Archer entered a not guilty plea on Vale's behalf and immediately began the public legal strategy of making the proceeding as long and expensive as possible, which was the strategy available to them. Thomas Greer testified before the grand jury. So did 2 other Vanguard employees who had come forward in the months since Greer's original cooperation: a quality assurance manager named Deborah Finch, who had documented her own concerns about VX7 warranty returns in 2011 and been told to stop, and a logistics coordinator named Paul Kessler, who had processed the Tercel distribution arrangements and kept his own records because, as he told investigators, something about it had never sat right with him. 3 people, in 3 different corners of the same company, all keeping the same quiet private faith that the paper would matter someday. Collins called Ethan when the indictment was announced. 4 counts, he said. It's a serious package. Will it hold? Ethan asked. The Greer emails alone are going to be very hard to defend. Adding the fabricated phone record on top of that. He's in real trouble. Collins paused. I want to be honest with you. These cases take years. Vale's defense will file motions, request delays, challenge evidence chains. You could be looking at 2 or 3 years before there's a verdict, if it goes to trial. If they negotiate a plea, it could be faster, but they'll wait as long as possible before they do that. I know, Ethan said. I've waited before. You have, Collins said. One more thing. Vanguard's civil exposure, the plaintiff lawsuits from the accident victims, those are moving towards settlement. The numbers are significant. And as part of the remediation framework, the company is establishing a formal engineering whistleblower protocol and a named fund for the recall victims. He paused carefully. Victoria's office has also indicated they want to have a conversation with you about compensation for the contractor arrangement and for the use of your engineering work. That conversation is going to involve me and their counsel, and it's probably a few months away, but I want you to know it's coming. Okay, Ethan said. You keep saying okay to things that are bigger than okay. I don't know what the right size of response is, Ethan said. I'm still processing. That's honest, Collins said. Take your time. September came in with the specific quality of Ohio early fall. The light going golden at the edges. The mornings carrying something cool that the afternoons didn't quite reach yet. Ethan finished the kitchen renovation. Not all at once. He wasn't built for dramatic overhauls, but piece by piece over 3 weekends, the way he did most things. New cabinets on the south wall. A backsplash he measured twice and installed once. A faucet that had been on his list since he bought the house. It looked like a kitchen now rather than a project. He stood in it one Sunday morning with his coffee and looked at the finished counter and felt a modest private satisfaction that was its own kind of completion. Marcus came in that Monday and said, "You seem different." "I finished the kitchen," Ethan said. "In your house?" "The renovation I started 8 years ago," Ethan said. "Finally finished it." Marcus thought about this. "Was it hard?" "Not really," Ethan said. "Mostly it was just not getting to it." He handed Marcus a work order for the day. "There's a Mazda 3 coming in at 10 with a mystery vibration between 55 and 65 miles an hour. I want you to drive it first. Tell me what you think before I touch it." Marcus looked at the work order. "You want my diagnosis?" "I want your observation," Ethan said. "There's a difference. Don't diagnose it. Just tell me exactly what you feel and when." The kid's face shifted in the specific way that young people's faces shift when they're given something real to do. He nodded and took the order and went to set up the bay. Ethan watched him for a moment, then turned back to his own work. Victoria came to Dunar in October, on a Tuesday, unannounced in the sense that she hadn't called ahead, but also not entirely unexpected. She'd mentioned in an email 2 weeks earlier that she'd like to talk in person before the end of fall, and Ethan had understood that as a commitment even without a date attached. She arrived in a regular car this time. No security detail, or at least none that was visible. She was in jeans and a jacket that was more functional than the last one, and she stood in the lot and looked at the shop with an expression different from the first time. Less assessment, more familiarity. Ethan came out of Bay 1. He'd been in the middle of an oil change, and he had grease on his hands again, same as always. "No lawyers today?" he asked. "No lawyers," she said. "Is that all right?" "Coffee's on," he said. They sat in the office the same way they'd sat 8 months ago, except the room felt different, not smaller or larger, just occupied differently, the way rooms change when the people in them know each other better. Victoria held her coffee mug, a different mug this time, one that said Caldwell Auto, honest work, fair price. In the same slightly uneven lettering as the sign, a set Ethan had ordered once as a shop promotion and never done anything with. "The settlement framework is finalized," she said. "The civil cases. 37 plaintiffs, including the families of the 4 fatalities. The number is substantial. It's not enough. Those families will tell you that, and they're right. But it's what the legal process produces, and it's being paid." She held the mug with both hands. "The Purcell family is part of it. Sandra Purcell and her husband." Ethan nodded. "I met with them last month," Victoria said. "In person. I went to their house." She paused. "I didn't know what I was going to say. I'd prepared things, and none of them felt right when I was actually standing at their door." She looked at the mug. "Sandra Purcell told me she didn't want an apology. She said," she was very direct about it, "she said apologies were for people who made mistakes. What happened to her daughter wasn't a mistake. Someone decided her daughter's life was an acceptable risk, and she wanted me to understand that distinction." The office was quiet. "She's right," Ethan said. "I know she is." Victoria set the mug down. "I've been thinking about that distinction for 2 months. The difference between a mistake and a decision. Your 2007 report, what happened to it wasn't a mistake. Someone looked at it and decided the inconvenience of fixing the problem was worth more than whatever risk they were transferring to people who didn't know they were carrying it." "Richard Vail," Ethan said. "Vail, and the people around him who let it happen, and a culture inside that company that made it easier to suppress a problem than to solve it." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to diffuse the responsibility. He made the call, but he made it in a building full of people, and most of them let it stand." "People like Greer and Finch and Kessler didn't," Ethan said. "No, they kept the paper." She paused. "Like you." There was a moment of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, the specific quiet of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and don't need to fill the space around it. "I have something for you," Victoria said. She reached into her jacket and produced an envelope and put it on the workbench. "This is formal. It's been reviewed by both our legal teams and it's clean. But I wanted to bring it myself rather than send it through counsel." Ethan looked at the envelope without picking it up. "What is it?" "2 things. First, a formal restoration of authorship credit for the VX7 engine architecture. The company's official engineering record has been amended to reflect your role as primary architect of the platform. That's in the personnel system, the patent record, and the company's published technical history." She paused. "Second, a settlement offer for the contractor arrangement and the use of your intellectual property over the period of the recall. The number is in the envelope." Ethan picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands without opening it. "You don't have to accept today," she said. "Collins has already reviewed it. He thinks it's fair, but that's your call." "I trust his read," Ethan said. He put the envelope down on the workbench. "The authorship credit. Does it matter, practically? The VX7 platform is probably going to be discontinued." "It's already been discontinued, but it matters to the record, and it matters—" She stopped herself. Started again. "There's a team at Vanguard right now working on the next platform. They're good engineers, young, most of them. They're going to build something real." She looked at him. "I want them to know who built the last real thing we had before we broke it. Because the way you designed that architecture, the fundamentals of it, before the fault, before the compromises, was genuinely good work. Our current chief engineer said so." In those words. Ethan set his coffee down and looked at the window. Outside, Mercer Road was doing its ordinary Tuesday thing. A pickup going by, a woman with a stroller, the slow traffic of a small town in the middle of the day. He thought about the years he'd spent in this building, doing real work for real people, and how that work had mattered in its own specific way that had nothing to do with what Vanguard Motors thought of him. He thought about Gene, the retired road worker, and what the wheel-bearing conversation had meant to Gene, even if neither of them had put words to it. He thought about Marcus in Bay 1 right now listening to a Mazda vibration at 60 miles an hour, trying to learn how to hear what a car was telling him. He also thought about 2007 and about the 18 pages of careful, precise engineering work that had sat on a desk and been folded into a campaign to make him small, and about how it felt to know that the work was right and have nobody around you willing to say so. "It matters," he said finally. "You're right. It matters." Victoria nodded. She didn't oversell it. That was one of the things he'd come to respect about her. She understood when the right move was to let a moment be what it was without adding to it. "How's the company doing?" he asked. She exhaled. "Honestly, it's still hard. The stock hasn't recovered. We lost 2 major fleet contracts after the recall went public. I've had to make cuts that I don't feel good about, and some of the people who left were people we couldn't afford to lose." She picked up her coffee again. "But the engineering team is intact, which was the first thing I protected. And the new platform design has had 0 compromise requests from the executive level. I've made that a non-negotiable. If someone comes to an engineering team with a business case for ignoring a safety concern, they come to me next, directly." "And what happens then?" Ethan asked. "We address the safety concern," she said, simply, without drama. "That's the policy. It's not a complicated policy." "No," Ethan said. "It never was." She almost smiled. "I know. I just work at the place that made it complicated." After she left, Ethan stood in the bay for a while with the envelope in his hand. He didn't open it immediately. He set it on the workbench and went and checked on Marcus, who had driven the Mazda and was standing beside it writing notes on a work order with the concentration of someone trying to be accurate. "What did you find?" Ethan asked. "It's consistent between 55 and 65, Marcus said. "Feels like it's in the wheel, not the drivetrain. It doesn't change when I accelerate or decelerate, just speed dependent. No pull to either side." He looked at the work order. "I think it's a balance issue. Maybe a weight fell off." Ethan looked at the car, looked at Marcus. "Check the left front wheel first," he said. "Look for where a balance weight was seated." Marcus went to the wheel and crouched down and looked. After 30 seconds, he said, "What? Yeah, there's a mark where something was." "Rebalance all 4, Ethan said. "Road test after." Marcus stood up. He was trying not to look too pleased with himself. "Was I right?" "You described what you felt and you reasoned from it," Ethan said. "That's the job. The specific answer you can get from a machine. The reasoning is what you have to build yourself." He went back to the office and opened the envelope. He read the settlement figure twice. Then he set it down and sat in the chair that creaked in its familiar way and looked at the restored light above him, the steady, silent one, and thought about whether a number on a paper could mean anything adequate. It couldn't. He knew that going in. What it could do was be fair, and Collins had said it was fair, and fair was a real thing even if it wasn't the same as whole. He signed the documents that afternoon and mailed them before he could overthink it. The trial of Richard Vale began the following spring, 14 months after the indictment, which was faster than Collins had expected and slower than Ethan had hoped. He testified on a Thursday in April in a federal courtroom in Columbus in front of a jury of 12 people and a gallery that included journalists and automotive industry observers, and a row near the back that Ethan understood, without being told, contained some of the plaintiff families. He wore the gray jacket. He told the truth in the same way he always told the truth. Without performance, without score settling, just the facts in order, with precision, the same way he'd been telling it since February of the year the recall broke. The facts were what they were. The documentation was what it was. 16 years of paperwork in green ledgers and fireproof boxes and hard drives didn't need him to dress it up. Vale's defense attorney, a composed man named Howard Lyle, who had clearly done this many times, spent 40 minutes on cross-examination trying to establish that Ethan's motivation was financial, that his documentation was self-serving, that his delay in reporting constituted implicit acceptance of the arrangement. Ethan answered each question the same way, directly, without defensiveness, going back to the factual record when the question strayed from it. At one point, Lyle said, "Mr. Caldwell, you accepted payments from Tercel Distribution for 10 years. Isn't it true that your financial interest in maintaining that arrangement influenced your decision not to report the defect earlier?" Ethan looked at the attorney. "Yes," he said. The courtroom went slightly quiet. "That's a factor in why I didn't report sooner than I did," Ethan continued. "I've said that in this proceeding and in prior testimony, and I'll say it however many more times I'm asked. I made a calculation that I could keep documenting while keeping the income, and I waited longer than I should have. I've known that since February of last year, when I read about 4 people dying from a fault I identified in 2007. He paused. "What my financial motivation doesn't explain is why I kept 18 pages of engineering documentation, 12 years of service ledgers, a photocopy of a memo with Richard Vale's name on it, and the original receipt document from the 2007 meeting for 16 years, with nothing to gain from any of it until the recall happened. My financial motivation also doesn't explain why I refused a payment offer from Mr. Vale personally when he came to my shop." Lyle moved on. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Ethan went back to Dunar and worked, because that was what he did. He replaced a catalytic converter on a 2015 Toyota RAV4. He did a full brake job on a school bus for the County Transit Authority, a contract he'd picked up last fall that he was quietly proud of because it was larger and more responsible than anything he'd done before. He helped Marcus diagnose an intermittent electrical fault on a 2008 Ford Focus that turned out to be a grounding issue hiding in plain sight, which was the kind of diagnostic problem that taught you more than the straightforward ones. Collins called on a Wednesday afternoon. Ethan was in the office eating lunch. "Guilty on 3 of 4 counts," Collins said. "Wire fraud, conspiracy to suppress material safety information, and the fraudulent statement charge. The obstruction count was split. The jury deadlocked on that one." Ethan set his sandwich down. 3 out of 4. 3 out of 4 is significant, Ethan. The conspiracy count carries substantial sentencing exposure. Sentencing is in 90 days. Collins paused. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said honestly. "Ask me in a few days." "That's fair," Collins said. "I'll send the full verdict documentation tonight." He hung up and sat in the quiet office. The light above him was steady and silent. Through the bay door he could hear Marcus on the phone with someone, probably his mother, who called at lunchtime sometimes, talking in the easy way of someone who wasn't performing. 3 counts, not 4. Vale's attorneys had found one seam in the obstruction case and pushed it wide enough for reasonable doubt, and that was the system doing what the system did. It wasn't perfect, it was just the available process, and 3 out of 4 was what it had produced. Ethan thought about what perfect would look like and couldn't quite construct it. Maybe Vale convicted on every count and sentenced heavily, and Sandra Purcell's daughter still being alive. That would be closer. But that wasn't a thing that justice could produce. Justice worked in the present on behalf of the past, and what was past was fixed. What you could do was make the record accurate. What you could do was make sure the thing that happened was named correctly and held to account, as well as the available tools allowed. What you could do was put your documentation in green ledgers and keep them on a shelf and be ready for the day when somebody with the right authority finally came to look. That was the whole of it, really. It wasn't a small thing. It also wasn't everything. Most true things exist in that space between those 2 facts, and learning to live there without needing it to be simpler than it is. That was the actual work, the kind that didn't have a repair manual and couldn't be finished in an afternoon. Ethan picked his sandwich back up. He ate the rest of it. He went back to work. Marcus left for Columbus State in September, earlier than expected. He'd applied to a mechanical engineering technology program and gotten in on a partial scholarship, and Ethan had written the recommendation letter in a single draft because there hadn't been much to figure out about what to say. He was a good kid who asked good questions and showed up 20 minutes early and had learned in 14 months how to listen to what a broken thing was telling him. That was enough for 2 pages. Marcus's last day was a Friday. He cleaned the bays with more attention than usual, and at the end of the day he stood in the office doorway and said, I learned a lot here. Good, Ethan said. More than like car stuff, Marcus said, working at the sentence. More than that. I know what you mean, Ethan said. It applies. Marcus nodded. He looked like he might say something else and then decided the conversation was at the right place to stop. He shook Ethan's hand, firm, direct, the handshake of someone who'd been paying attention to small things, and walked out. Ethan watched him go. He hired a part-time mechanic named Roy 2 weeks later, 43 years old, recently relocated from Dayton, good hands and a quiet manner and a tendency to double-check his own work that Ethan considered the most important quality in a mechanic after honesty. The shop kept running. It was November when Victoria came back a second time, and this time she called ahead. She came on a Saturday morning, the town quiet the way it was on November Saturdays, the light thin and the air carrying the serious cold that Ohio meant when it was done suggesting. Ethan had come in early to get ahead on some paperwork and was sitting in the office with the second cup of coffee when she pulled up. She had a folder with her. She set it on the workbench and opened it. This is the final version, she said. The amended patent record, the official engineering history, the personnel file correction. All of it in one place. Ethan looked at the documents, his name, in the official typography of the company that had spent 17 years without it. Primary architect, VX7 powertrain platform. The dates of the original work. The authorship of the 2007 engineering report. That's it, Victoria said. That's what I can give you. He looked at it for a while. He was aware of the gap between what the documents said and what the actual years had felt like, between the formal restoration and the informal cost of what had been taken. You couldn't reconcile those things in a folder on a workbench. The folder was a real thing and also a small thing in comparison to the real thing, and both of those facts were true at the same time. Thank you, he said, for coming yourself. I wasn't going to mail it, she said. He closed the folder and set it aside and picked up his coffee. Victoria leaned against the workbench in the way of someone who didn't quite want to leave yet. Outside, a cold wind moved through Mercer Road and found the gap under the bay door and came in along the floor. What happens with the new platform? Ethan asked. We're 12 months from a production announcement. The engineering team has been running it clean. Every risk assessment goes through a full documentation cycle. Everything gets signed off at the engineering level before it moves to product development. She paused. We named the documentation protocol, the Internal Safety Reporting Framework. He looked at her. It's called the Caldwell Protocol, she said, after the standard set in the 2007 report. He didn't say anything for a moment. I should have asked you first, she said, before I approved it. I'm asking now, retroactively, which I know isn't how asking works. It's fine, he said. I don't mind. Does it mean anything to you? Ethan thought about it honestly. It means that somebody looked at what a thorough, honest engineering report looks like and decided to call that a standard rather than an inconvenience. He paused. Yeah, that means something. Victoria nodded. She straightened up and buttoned her jacket against the cold that was working its way in. I should let you get to your Saturday. Not much on a Saturday, Ethan said. I come in for the quiet. She smiled at that. A real one, not the managed version she'd had 8 months ago at the first meeting. She left the folder. She drove back toward Columbus. Ethan sat with his coffee in the steady light of the office and listened to the shop settle in its particular way around him. The tick of the heating system, the wind at the door, the ordinary sounds of a building that had been standing a long time and expected to keep standing. He thought, not for the first time and not with any particular drama, about what it meant to do the right thing over a long enough timeline that the right thing stops feeling like a choice and just becomes the way you are. He thought about Thomas Greer and Deborah Finch and Paul Kessler, all of them making their own private decisions to hold on to the paper, to keep the record, to not let the thing dissolve into the convenient version. He thought about Marcus Teal at Columbus State in a classroom somewhere, maybe learning how to read a diagnostic report, maybe already knowing something about what it meant to listen to what a broken thing was trying to tell you. He thought about what institutions do to people who tell the truth at the wrong time. Not the dramatic version, the gradual version, the way they make you smaller and quieter and eventually peripheral, the way they replace your name in the file with someone else's, and call it a reorganization and expect you to accept the arithmetic. He thought about what it took to not accept it. Not loudly. Ethan had never done any of this loudly, but persistently. The specific stubbornness of keeping records when no one was watching, of documenting things no one was asking you to document, of believing that the truth was worth preserving even when it was costing you something and no one could see what it was costing. That kind of integrity didn't announce itself. It didn't have a press conference. It showed up in green ledgers and fireproof boxes, and the specific quality of a man who could sit in a storage room full of his own documentation and say, plainly, without self-pity, I kept everything because I figured someday somebody was going to need to know what actually happened. The world had a lot of names for that quality, and most of them were too small for it. Ethan didn't have a name for it either. He just knew that some things were worth the trouble of preserving, and that you found out which things by finding the ones you couldn't make yourself let go of, even when letting go would have been easier and more comfortable and nobody would have blamed you. He'd never been able to let go of the truth about those engines. He didn't think that made him heroic. He thought it made him stubborn in a particular direction. But sometimes stubborn in the right direction for long enough was what the situation actually needed. Not a good ending. Life didn't reliably provide those, but a real accounting, a record that held, a name in a file that could not be permanently removed. The coffee was cold. He didn't notice until he drank it. He set the mug down, picked up the folder Victoria had left, and put it in the filing cabinet, the bottom drawer of the first cabinet, which opened smoothly because he'd fixed the runner 2 months ago, finally, after 2 years of meaning to. He closed the drawer. Outside on Mercer Road, a car went past slowly, the way cars do when someone is looking for an address, and then turned back and pulled into the lot. Ethan heard the door open and footsteps cross the gravel. He went out to see what they needed.